Sometimes I dread telling people what I do for a living. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm incredibly proud of my job and I feel privileged to be able to do it. But what I didn't realise when I started practising immigration law, what no one tells you, is that when your job has the word immigration in the title, you'll be expected to defend it in all sorts of situations. At a party, in a black cab, when taking out the rubbish. This defence takes place in a climate where the words that we see here represent a lot of the rhetoric on immigration. Let me give you an example. As anyone who's taken a black cab in London will know, London cabbies are insatiably curious. And one of the first questions they ask, after checking where it is that you're going, is, "What do you do for a living, love?" Now, I will generally try to answer this question with the suitably generic, "Oh, I'm a lawyer." And I'll admit, this in and of itself can be enough to turn your listener against you. But it's the answer to the follow-up question which has gotten me into real trouble. What area of law? My answer, immigration, on one occasion led to the cabbie responding, "Oh, do you help keep them out?" To which I had to delicately respond that no, actually, I help keep them in. What followed was a cab journey where I attempted to undo years of misinformation about immigration while travelling back from a wedding at midnight. As someone duty-bound to defend immigration, I ensure that I'm always well armed with lots of statistics about it. On this occasion, the conversation went something like this. The taxi driver would say, "Oh, we don't have space for any more immigrants and they're all claiming benefits anyways." I would respond with some information about how immigrants are in fact much less likely to claim benefits than their UK counterparts, and some stats about the billions of pounds of income generated by immigrants in the UK. He would respond by telling me a story his friend's friend had told him about a European family who'd recently moved into the area and were already claiming benefits. And just like that, he believed that he had won the argument. And so it went on until, thankfully, the journey came to an end. Now, I sometimes relish the opportunity to counter commonly held misconceptions about immigration. But to be honest with you, after a friend's wedding at midnight, it can be exhausting. It can also often feel pointless. What I've discovered from these interactions is that I could share all the information in the world about the amazing benefits that immigration brings, but people's own perceived experiences and anecdotes that they've heard will trump any factual analysis. In other words, telling stories and not statistics would be a more effective way to get my point across. People believe what they have seen and heard, even if it's not reflective of a broader truth. This can be reflected in surveys of public opinion. In 2009, the British Social Attitude Survey asked people to estimate what percentage of the population was made up of non-Western immigrants. The most common response was 25%. And yet in reality, the actual percentage of total immigrants in the UK was 11%, less than half of what people believed it to be. Well, and why does it matter if anyone believes the real statistics over their own stories? It matters because what we've seen is that in the world of immigration, what people believe about it is what matters to the politicians tasked with doing something about it. We don't even have to look very deeply to see that what the public believes has this kind of influence. In 2016, the Secretary of State, Amber Rudd, told us that we had to reduce immigration in order to change the tide of public opinion. What she's telling us is that the public believes immigration is too high, therefore we must act as if it is too high, and we must take steps to reduce it. She doesn't seek to analyse if the public is right, or even why the public feels the way that they do. She doesn't seek to contrast the public's view with the facts that we have about immigration. She just takes a reading of public opinion and bases policy on it. And so the prime motivating factor for immigration law in the UK has been to reduce the number of people coming here. In order to do this, we've seen changes across the board. If you're a student, it's harder to get a visa. even though there are estimates which suggest that international students contribute anywhere from between 13 to 18 billion pounds to the UK economy. If you're a worker, it's harder to get a visa, despite the fact that UK businesses tell us that they need access to international talent in order to continue to compete in an increasingly global market. If you're married to a British person, it's harder to get a visa, although this has meant that families are increasingly likely to be split up and children could be separated from parents for years at a time. One way of looking at these changes would be to say that by implementing them, we've deprived ourselves of income from international students, we've hampered the opportunities of UK businesses in an international market, and we've destabilised families. Another way of looking at them would be to say that we've helped to reduce immigration and therefore we've satisfied public demand. We can see that the stories that people come across, whether in the press, in their personal lives, or from a friend in the pub, can reinforce negative ideas about immigration and help to substantiate views that people hold that don't necessarily reflect reality. This leads to a public who are increasingly hostile to immigration, with immigration itself now one of the single biggest issues of concern to British voters. All at a time when the benefits of immigration are as real as ever. It leads to much of the negative rhetoric about immigration that we see represented behind me. Words which evoke a sense that immigrants are different, they are the other, and they are to blame. These negative views of immigration then feed into public policy, leading to immigration rules which are tougher and more restrictive. Because the public concern that we're seeking to address is that immigration is too high. By seeking to address fears that immigration is too high without looking behind public opinion, we actually run the risk of failing to address the real concerns. After all, if the public is concerned that immigration is too high because immigrants disproportionately claim benefits, that suggests they have deeper concerns about pressures on public finances. But if in reality, immigrants aren't claiming benefits on any significant scale, then reducing immigration won't actually have any impact on public finances. And it could actually make things worse. After all, we have an ageing population. We may need the tax contributions from younger immigrants in order to fund the pensions, health, and social care of our ageing native population. Simply acquiescing to public opinion also ignores the moral and legal obligations we have with regard to taking in refugees, to facilitating family life, and to protecting the most vulnerable in society. I'd therefore love to simply argue for an immigration policy which ignores public opinion, one rooted in fact, yes, but also compassion and respect for human rights. Unfortunately, the ripples of public opinion on policy seem too strong to ignore. So instead of just advocating for a barrier between unfounded public opinion and the policies that it creates, I think we need to learn to be better immigration defenders. We need to learn how to tell stories and not just statistics. I think we're starting to see that although public opinion remains overwhelmingly anti-immigration, there have been some glimpses of pro-immigration sentiment, and these have largely been the result of human stories. Most heartbreakingly, we can look at the story of Alan Kurdi, the Syrian refugee child who was found dead on a beach. His image and the unfiltered image of his death that it represented to many showed the very human suffering at the heart of the refugee crisis and generated compassion for an issue which up until then had been lacking it. Scenes of families being split up at airports following the imposition of Trump's first travel ban generated public, vocal, and global support for those immigrants and global condemnation for the ban. The story of a Singapore woman, Irene Clennell, who'd been married to a British man for 27 years, but was removed from the UK recently because she didn't hold a valid visa, attracted considerable press attention and public support, including significant financial support, as we can see. On this particular story, I was asked by a number of family and friends, how could this happen? Wasn't it outrageous? And I thought, well, yes, it's outrageous, but in UK immigration terms, it wasn't unusual in the slightest. I see this sort of thing all the time. And then I realised, this was it. This was my story. The next time I'm called upon to defend immigration, I would draw attention to stories like this. For this is how I think we begin to actually turn the tide of public opinion, not by pandering to a false narrative, but by telling stories that people care about, by informing people of the facts with non-fiction stories. For stories seem to have a sticking power in people's minds in a way that statistics simply don't. We can see this on a broader scale with reference to the British Social Attitude Survey, which in 2014 asked the public for their view on the impact of immigration. They divided their results up based on whether the respondents considered themselves to have friends who were migrants. Amongst those who said they had several friends who were migrants, 70% had a positive or neutral view of the cultural and economic impacts of immigration. By contrast, amongst those who considered themselves to have no friends who were migrants, 60% had a negative view of immigration. People, therefore, with lived experience of migrant stories are much more likely to have a positive view of immigration. And what do we stand to gain if we can begin to tell the stories of immigrants rather than the statistical impact of immigration? We can change the trajectory of public opinion on immigration. And if negative public opinion ripples into policies aimed at reducing immigration, it must be the case that positive public opinion could have the opposite effect. Removing the pressure of negative opinion would also free politicians to take a more compassionate stance on refugees and families separated by the UK immigration rules. In 2016, it was suggested, having a slight tech issue, if you bear with me, that the UK could take up to 3,000 of the approximately 90,000 unaccompanied child refugees across Europe. In late 2016, some of these children began arriving in the UK, and their arrival was accompanied with headlines like this: news stories which focused on their age and cast doubt on whether they could really be under 18. These stories didn't tell the stories of the arduous and dangerous journeys that these children had made. The headlines didn't detail the lives that these children were fleeing. Instead, they cast the children as threatening, as liars, and as a burden. In the negative light cast by these stories, the government has announced that the programmes will now close, with only 350 children, barely 10% of the original estimate, having benefited from it. How we see these children and the stories we hear about them matter. Stories about immigration in all its forms matter, and they can make a difference, because ultimately it is these stories which have the capacity to transform how we think about immigration. These stories are the way we change public opinion and public debate about immigration, and the influence that those debates have on policy. Irene Clennell, the Singaporean woman recently removed from the UK, wrote about her experience shortly after removal. She concluded with an appeal to those who have made migrant a term of abuse to consider the human costs of their actions. I think Irene has perfectly summed up the challenge that lies before us. The prize, though, in successfully changing attitudes and humanising views on immigration is clear. We can change the rhetoric on immigration from this to this. For all of us who believe it is important to have an immigration policy rooted in fact and underpinned by compassion and respect for human rights, the time to start telling these stories is now. For I believe if we want to achieve this goal, we all need to learn to be better immigration defenders. Thank you.